Fox Report, and tonight, America's growing military involvement in an increasingly unstable Iraq. The president saying the U.S. will protect our citizens there and innocent Iraqis fleeing for their lives from dangerous ISIS terrorists. The Defense Department releasing new video showing two of what have been several airstrikes on ISIS targets. One shows an F-A-18 Hornet taking out ISIS artillery. Another strike shows a fighter plane taking out an ISIS truck. Speaking today before leaving for vacation, President Obama made it clear at no point will there be any U.S. combat troops on the ground. But he couldn't give a timetable for how long this new mission will go on, saying it comes down to how Iraqis stand up to the terror threat.
Once an inclusive government is in place, I'm confident it will be easier to mobilize all Iraqis against ISIL and to mobilize greater support from our friends and allies. Ultimately, only Iraqis can ensure the security and stability of Iraq. The United States can't do it for them, but we can and will be partners in that effort.
Separate from airstrikes is a second humanitarian mission. The U.S. continuing airdrops of supplies, food, and water to thousands of refugees on the run from the brutal carnage being waged by ISIS militants. Some have sought shelter in churches. Others have been forced to flee to remote mountains after being driven from their homes. ISIS, or the Islamic State, also now controls Iraq's largest Christian town. Fox News has confirmed at least 200,000 people have fled Iraq's northern Christian region. Others have fled to churches, feeling unsafe in their homes for fear of being tortured to death. Women and children senselessly killed by terrorists for not converting to Islam. We have a lot to get to tonight. We begin, though, with Wendell Goler, who is in Martha's Vineyard, where the president is currently vacationing. Wendell, is President Obama bracing the country for a long mission in Iraq or not?
Well, Julie, he says it will not be over in a matter of weeks. As you pointed out, we've had several strikes today. Fighters and drones, U.S. fighters and drones, targeting armored personnel carriers. There's no indication whether the ISIS fighters took them from Iraqi forces when they fled Mosul, but that appears to be likely. Mr. Obama spoke with the leaders of the U.K., France, and Germany before leaving the White House. He urged them to join the humanitarian effort, though not the fighting. He says the most urgent thing now is to protect the U.S. consulate in Erbil and to get the tens of thousands of refugees off of Sinjar Mountain, which he says is going to be complicated. They're going to have to form a corridor for them to safely exit that mountain. In the meantime, he says the Iraqis need to form a government that doesn't alienate the Kurds and encourage the Sunnis to side with the ISIS rebels.
The most important timetable that I'm focused on right now is the Iraqi government getting formed and finalized. Because in the absence of an Iraqi government, it is very hard to get a unified effort by Iraqis against ISIL. We can conduct airstrikes, but ultimately there's not going to be an American military solution to this problem.
The president says the Iraqis have taken some good first steps, naming a Kurdish president and a Sunni parliament speaker. Now he says they need a prime minister, and he suggests it should not be Nouri al-Maliki again. Julie?
And so his critics say he bears some responsibility for this. What's the White House's response?
Well, the president's aides say if he'd left U.S. forces in Iraq, they'd be targets because the Iraqi people were tired of occupiers and because Iraq's government would still have alienated the Sunnis and Kurds, which is what leads the Sunnis to fight for ISIS. But while Mr. Obama says it's Iraq's job to deal with the ISIS fighters, his critics say the U.S. could and should do a lot more to damage the group than we've done so far.
It means it's not an operation. It's just a pinprick. It's just a sideshow. It's just a deflection from the normal course of things. You give something an operation, you provide a commander in the field, you connect with your allies, in this case the Kurds, and you get on with it. We haven't done that.
Critics also say he should have dealt with ISIS in Syria, though the White House says that would have been complicated without help from Syria's government. Julie?
Wendell Goler, thank you very much. Well, some of our key allies are now joining the U.S. in providing emergency aid to the thousands of displaced Iraqis. This is video of British planes dropping food, water, and other much-needed supplies to thousands of refugees. The French are also helping us dropping supplies, but with ISIS still capturing territory, our aid drops and targeted air strikes really enough to turn the tide? Joining me now here in studio is Rick Grenell, a former spokesman for 4 U.S. ambassadors to the UN. Thank you so much for talking to us. This crisis is huge. The Christians on the ground that are being tortured to death. I mean, we have seen such graphic images on the internet of poor children being caught in the middle of this crossfire, if you will. But we don't have boots on the ground. The president has no intention on sending more boots to the ground. So with airstrikes and airdrops, how are we to defeat ISIS?
Well, first of all, I think the president is right. President Obama is correct when he says that the Iraqis have to do more. The Iraqi government has to get organized and do a lot more. But we definitely have a role to play. I mean, obviously, no one needs to hear the history of the sacrifices that the Americans have made in Iraq. It's a long history. We've invested so much that we need to be there. The first thing is we're finding ourselves playing catch up right now because we fulfilled this campaign promise of President Obama to pull troops out of Iraq and Afghanistan no matter what. There was no diplomatic plan in place to help organize our Arab allies, to try to fill that vacuum. That vacuum was created too fast by just simply removing people quickly. Right. We should have been able to negotiate a status of forces agreement and have some sort of a small presence. I take the president at his word that he doesn't want to drag us into a military conflict again so quickly. Right. But taking it off the table, Julie, so fast is really not the right strategy. We need to have a diplomatic strategy before we find ourselves doing little pinpricks of military operations. I mean, CENTCOM today basically said we saw 4 different areas where ISIS was firing upon Iraqis, and so we fired on them. That's not a diplomatic strategy. Right. And as you pointed out earlier, the French, the British, everyone wants to do something in the region. Our Arab allies want to figure out what can happen, but they need to have a plan, and the U.S. is usually the only one to develop that plan, and then we sell it on.
So we need to lead.
We need to lead.
We need to lead. How are we going to take the lead? How are we going to spare more of these lives that are being sacrificed under the hand of terrorists? I asked many of my Twitter followers at Julie Banderas, how long should the U.S. remain in Iraq and the humanitarian crisis there? A couple responses here maybe you can touch on. Block Tax MZN writes, giving humanitarian aid is great in the short term, but we will eventually have to deal with those enemy who are the problem. Vance Gregory writes, when it comes to the Kurds, as long as it takes. They have always been U.S. friendly. We left them before, and 100,000 were killed.
I mean, it's a great point. In the short term, we can do minor things, but we got to have a long-term strategy, and that means really doing things early. I think the president has always kind of looked at the situation as either we go to war or we ignore the situation, but there's a whole bunch of diplomacy that we can do, and we haven't been doing that at all, and that means acting early, and what I mean by acting is organizing, not military action, but getting in there early. I mean, take just, for instance, in Ukraine, when the people took to the streets in November of last year, we should have been right there to help them organize. But instead, we didn't do anything until March, April. We waited too long. The same thing happened in Iran. The same thing happened in Syria. And as you know, ISIS is stronger because they weren't challenged in Syria. They became strong and moved into Iraq. Right. Because of no challenge in Syria.
Seminole52 on Twitter writes me, we have to stay in Iraq as long as it takes. We don't want to fight them in America. Don't let them get to America.
Yeah.
The bottom line is that if ISIS is a branch of al-Qaeda, we went to Iraq in the beginning to kill Osama bin Laden, okay? And in interim, you know, we've removed all those troops. It's been 3 years since he started scaling back. Here we are going back in again.
Yeah.
It almost sounds like we're restarting another war, this one not against al-Qaeda but ISIS. It's not going to be solved overnight. President Obama has said that. But what do you do to solve it? How much military intervention does the United States need to do?
Well, first of all, I'm a diplomat, and I try to do diplomacy first. Once the diplomats fail at the State Department, after they have exhausted
Where
every
is the UN
plan,
in all of this?
Then you transfer it over to the Department of Defense. The UN, of course, the UN has been all over the Gaza situation. They've had emergency Security Council meetings because of Gaza, but the humanitarian disasters in other parts, Africa even, and here in Iraq, they have really missed. And sadly, it's just because there's no leadership, even from the United States.
And so the leader of the United States, what does he do from Martha's Vineyard? He's on vacation. Should he come back?
Yeah, I mean, look, the president deserves to have some vacations. I think there's an argument to say that
Right.
he's been having way too many vacations. He certainly can develop a plan out, when he's on vacation in Martha's Vineyard. The first thing he's got to do is he needs to get rid of the National Security Council people who are highly political, who are still running campaigns, who, Ben Rhodes today said that the military operation was designed to send a message. Well, that's not what we need. We need a plan.
The terrorists are trying to send a very strong message to the Western world. Kill all Jews, kill all Christians.
Yeah.
They're doing it in Israel. They're doing it in Iraq.
Yeah, we've got to have a plan of action. It's like a balloon. If you try to get them in Iraq, they're going to pop up somewhere else in Jordan or Lebanon or where they already are in Syria. Let's remember one thing. Al-Qaeda distanced itself from ISIS because Al-Qaeda said they were too brutal and too inflexible.
Too brutal.
And too inflexible.
Words from
You think about
Al-Qaeda. That is
Yeah.
scary. Rick Grinnell, thank you very much for
Thanks,
coming in
Julie.
to
Good
talk
to see
to us.
you.
We appreciate it.